I call this the holy invitation because I think, as I've said to many of you before, that we tend to go into this last part of life. Now, you get to decide what the last part of life is. If you're a Richard Rohr fan, the last part of life is from 50 on. If you're a David Brooks fan, any of you are into political commentators, then you're also talking about from 50 on. But for some authors, life is divided more into 3 parts, each around 30 years, in which case that's from 60 on. I don't think it really matters. There is no magic age. But at some point, and that's what we're going to talk about, we all get to a place where we realize we're in our final act, our last act. Now, I'm not a theater person, but in a typical play, in the old-fashioned typical plays, there were always 3 acts. And all the good stuff was saved for the 3rd act. And you can really tell when you're watching an old play because that is still the case. That's when people fall in love. That's when people find out what's going on. That's when they forgive. That's when they have, a new start. So I don't care what metaphor you like, or maybe you don't like any of those metaphors at all. Maybe you just want to say, well, I'm just where I am. But I think there's a holy invitation, like in every place in life, whether you're a new parent, or you're a new college student, or you're going into high school for the first time, or you're having your first, big job promotion. At every point in life, there is a holy invitation. And that, thank you. Bye. And that holy invitation is to take whatever the step is that you're in, to take it with God. To not leave God out of the decisions you're making and the choices you're making. So that's all I mean by a holy invitation. Okay? Come on. Come on. This is, I don't usually have this kind of trouble. This is crazy.
Does it need a new battery?
No, it looks like it's working just fine. That's all right. So let me check in with you guys. I pretty much wasted all of our check-in time, but I'm gonna do this real quickly. I'm wanting to know. You can just yell it out. Don't be. You're such a raucous group. How do you feel about growing older?
Yeah.
Great. Great. Not great. That's perfect. Look at that. Great. Not great. Okay. What do you think? Pains? Patrick's like, well, there's no feeling. It just is. That's what Patrick's saying.
I never thought I'd be old.
I never thought I'd be old. It's better than the alternative. Amen. Have y'all ever known someone who, when you ask them how they're doing, they're like, I'm on the right side of the grass? Have you got a relative like that? My country relative would say that. He would say, I'm on the right side of the grass. And I was like, okay, I guess you're good. I guess it's fine.
Better to be seen than
What
heard.
fears? Let's talk about fears. What fears do you carry about growing old? Dementia. It is, and I have a very dear friend who carries some gene that it's present in her family, and she did the genetic. I would have never done it, but she did because she wanted to know. So her fear is very, very high. She's going to see a neurologist, and she's a younger woman, but she's going to see a neurologist and tell that workup. I'm kind of like, no, I'm fine. Don't tell me. Don't tell me until my keys are in the refrigerator and I can't find them. But having lived through it with loved ones, I think I fear it less. I know that sounds weird, but I think I fear it a little bit less. It all depends. Fear is fear. It doesn't necessarily make sense. What else are you afraid of? Pain, dementia, running out of money? Yeah.
Being dependent?
Being dependent.
Yeah.
Guess what? We all get to be dependent. Yay! That's a fear. That's a fear. What else?
Loneliness.
Loneliness.
Being alone.
Being alone. Yeah. Sometimes you don't know you're afraid until you go and visit someone in a nursing home. And then you feel your fears, right? But there's nothing wrong with these. These are regular human emotions. But it's important to understand that if you're going to really accept aging as a holy invitation, you have to know what your fears are and what negative things you're carrying with you. You also have questions. We all have questions. Wouldn't you like, or would you like, to have it written out what it's all going to be like? I don't know. I don't think so. Write out all the good things that are going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing about what we're going to talk about is there's a lot of losing control. And y'all haven't talked about it, but you've talked around it. The fears, the feelings, a lot of it has to do with not being independent and losing control. And so many of the questions we have is, well, how's that going to work? Where am I going to live? You know, will I have a caregiver? You know, you start looking at your family and you start kind of making observations. Okay, this is a cone of silence. You're not going to share this with anyone. Got it? But my father, who did have dementia, an unusual kind of dementia, but he did. When it came time, they had to come live by one of the daughters. The thing about Dad is he didn't have a lot of filters anymore, and he literally said at a big family meeting, so it was like in front of everybody, well, here's the deal, I love both my daughters, but she's too bossy. And we were quite sure which of us she was talking about, like, is that me or is that my sister? At the time he was talking about my sister, but he said that about me too. But so, I mean, I think lots of things that we can't, let's be honest, many things we cannot know. Is that any different from being 30?
No.
Or 40?
Not really.
Or 20? Absolutely not. But have you ever asked yourself this question? And that's what I want to do for these next few weeks. What do you think God's desire might be for you as you grow older? What would God's desire be for you? That's what I'm going to try and think about. And I find this question not just comforting, but instructive to me as I try and make decisions about this last, I'm going to say last third, though I know for a fact I don't have a third left, but I always say that anyway. It makes me feel good. So I'm going to start with Psalm 71. Psalm 71 is probably not a psalm that is part of your devotional reading because it's very specific. But as people in the third part of life, maybe it should be part of our devotional reading. Let me just read part of it for you. In you, O Lord, I take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me and rescue me. Incline your ear to me and save me. Be to me a rock of refuge, a strong fortress to save me, for you are my rock and my fortress. Does that sound good? Mm-hmm. It sounds like a mighty fortress is our God. That sounds like the Psalms are supposed to sound, right? For you, O Lord, are my hope and my trust. From my youth, from my birth, I have leaned upon you, my protector, since my mother's womb. My praises continually of you. I've been like a portent to many, but you are my strong refuge. My mouth is filled with your praise and with your glory all day long. 9th verse. Do not cast me off in the time of old age. Do not forsake me when my strength is spent. Did you know that was there? Usually when we read it in worship, we stop right here. We stop at the 8th verse. But the psalmist is reflecting on the fact that our God is our God every day, from the womb to the grave. This is pre-Christ, guys. From the womb to the grave. And as poets often do, the psalmist continues to develop that idea a little bit. My enemies speak concerning me. Those who watch for my life consult together. They say, pursue and seize that person whom God has forsaken, for there is no one to deliver. O God, do not be far from me. O my God, make haste and help me. Let my accusers be put to shame and consumed. Let those who seek to hurt me be covered with scorn and disgrace. But I will hope continually and will praise you yet more and more. My mouth will tell of your righteous acts, of your deeds of salvation all day long, though their number is past my knowledge. I will come praising the deeds of the Lord God. O God, from my youth you have taught me, and I still proclaim your wondrous deeds. So even to old age and gray hairs, O God, do not forsake me until I proclaim your might to all generations to come. Our power and your righteousness, O God, reach the high heavens. You who have done great things, O God, who is like you? The thing about the Psalms is there's an interwoven kind of message here of praise. This is the God of all good things, the God who's always been there for me. And the psalmist is still doing some petitioning, right? So now that I'm getting older and now that I've got gray hair, don't forget me. In the day of the psalmist, what would old age have been? 40 would have been really old age. And the problem with being 40 in the world of the psalmist is you'd be easily taken advantage of. You'd be easily taken advantage of by your grown children, by your neighbors, by anyone who might want your fields or want your house. Or I mean, it's not like you had, elderly abuse laws out there. And so losing your strength and your vitality was an issue. And this psalmist is sitting there saying, well, wait a minute. You've been here since the beginning. You're not going anywhere. I praise you. I tell your deeds. Even if I've got gray hair, I'm still useful. Do you notice he's saying, I'm really still useful to you, God. Because I can still tell your mighty deeds. And I know things that these upstarts don't know. I can do it. I'm really wrestling with this song. That goes on. But this is the part that I'm interested in. And I wanted to start with this. If you think about what is God's desire for us, I think this is really important. That we are not alone, we're not forsaken. And can I be so bold to say an old age was created? I mean, it is the natural order. Why? Why? Well, the psalmist gives us a hint, but I have some wonderful books I've been reading, and I'm going to share some of it with you that might take us a little further. Any questions or concerns about that? You should see your faces, you're all just going, okay. All right. So for fun, let's do a little running start for those of you who weren't in my little lunch and learn and talk about the seasons of life as I am beginning to understand them. And remember, I told you there are other ways. Richard Rohr, David Brooks, they have other ideas, but this is the way I'm thinking these days about the seasons of life. Thinking of myself in the third season. Thinking of all of you in the third season. If you're not in the third season, then you're not age appropriate. You should be in the third season by now. If we were in the 1500s and we were mystics and we were students of John of the Cross, the seasons of life were described to the monks in ancient Christianity this way, which means many of our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, our Anglican brothers and sisters, still think about life this way, that the first third of life is the dark night of the senses. Think about people 30 and under. They are driven by what? What they feel. Whether it's pleasure or happiness or contentment or safety. And the monks called that the dark night of the senses, that when someone was entering religious life, they had to kind of get over all that. That kind of being driven by passions and all those good things. And then the second season of life, and the way they would describe it, was the time of proficiency. It's the time when you did your work. If you're a monk, this is the time of life when you were, copying manuscripts, you were, praying, you were kind of mentoring younger monks, that kind of thing. If you were a householder, a religious person who had a home, this is obviously the time of life when you're raising your family and you're building your business and all those good things, a time of proficiency. But then, according to monks, the third season of life is more the dark night of the spirit. When proficiency is past, when you've got all your senses kind of in order, all of a sudden the spiritual side of life shines brighter. And I'm not a mystic. I've never lived in a monastic community, but this is the time when deep spiritual work is done. And that was the understanding in convents and monasteries, and it's still the understanding that deep spiritual work, it's done all your life, but the deepest spiritual work is done in the last third of life because you have experience, you have things to forgive, you have things to be forgiven for, and you have things because your body and maybe your mind is starting to fail on you a bit. The one thing that you can concentrate on is the life of the Spirit. And so in those communities, and still today in those communities, older people were given less work to do so they could spend more time on this, not because they were incapable necessarily. Does that make sense? And the program I'm in at the Oak Lake School of Theology has a lot of 80-year-old nuns and priests because they are not proficient anymore at what they've done their whole lives. And some of these people have done amazing things. I mean, they've run orphanages. They've run orders. They've been in charge of all kinds of things. But now they're focusing on the life of the Spirit. Here's an easier way to put it. The first third of life, you're struggling to get your, together. The second part of life, you're struggling to give your life away. If, in a spiritual sense, all that proficiency is to be serving other people. And then you struggle to age gracefully and give your death away, is where we are. I know. Look at Shirley goes, I don't like that. I don't like that. I don't blame you. But that's one way of looking at it. Here's another way. How about this? The hungry child, the nurturing adult, and the blessing elder.
That's good.
Isn't that good? I like that. Let's go with that. That's what we're going to go with. Okay, we're going to go with that. I like that. Okay, so this is just to show you some different ways of thinking about where we are in life. Now, how does it begin? How does this shift happen from proficiency and doing things and being things and busyness into where we are now? Well, obviously circumstances change, right? Some people get to retire, some people's kids leave the house, some people have enough financial security that they don't have to worry and fight so much, or a disease of some kind. But circumstances change externally, and the question emerges, and maybe it's emerged for you, maybe not in this way, in this word, but what are these remaining years for? I'm just curious, doesn't have to be an existential issue, problem, but has this question come up in your life or the life of your family? What are these remaining years for? It has.
Checkers.
What made it happen?
Checkers.
Huh?
Somebody said checkers.
Checkers.
Yeah, checkers.
Illness.
Oh, illness. Okay. So illness might made it happen. What else might have made it happen?
Retirement.
Grandchildren. Grandchildren can be a big bridge to this because you can be really young and vibrant and not thinking that you're in your third half of life, and all of a sudden these beautiful little human beings come into the world and you want a different relationship with them than you had with your kids. They need a different relationship with you than they have with their mom and dad. And it can start begging the question, okay, well, how's that gonna work? What else?
Retirement.
Retirement is a big one. Okay, what are these remaining years for? And have y'all read all those little articles? Because I'm 65, I get these articles all the time. I'm about to be 65. Not there yet. But these articles will be like, the things you need to think about before you retire. Y'all remember, if y'all read all these? And it's like, don't just retire. You gotta have a plan. And in a spiritual sense, I think that's a really good point. What are these remaining years for? What does God and nature intend for me now? Now, notice I'm saying God and nature, because God has some say, nature has some say, right? I have a dear friend, she's not much older than I am, she's almost blind. I have two friends, actually, who are blind, functionally blind. Wasn't their choice. One, it was a retina detachments and all kinds of things. The other, it doesn't matter, but anyway, they are. But here they are, they're 60-something. So nature did something. Now what does God intend? Yeah.
Well, freedom hasn't come up in our discussion, but now you're retired, you don't have a job, you have no responsibilities. If you don't have, if your grandkids or kids are growing up, you don't
Right.
have kids' responsibility.
Right,
You're financially well off. You
That's
don't-
right.
So also you have total freedom.
You have
So what do you do with your freedom?
that is a really
You
good
do a golf
point.
game, you go traveling,
Yeah.
I mean, you just sit and watch TV.
Yep, and I love the ads that with the kissing tree out in San Marcos. We'll tell you what to do with your freedom. Come live out here with us, right? And you can do yoga, and you can have your workout classes, you can have happy hour with friends every night. I mean, it looks really good.
Pickleball.
But pickleball, but Randy, I agree with you. I'm smart enough that I'm looking at it, yeah, I'm going, I'm not so sure about
They
that.
advertise like
Yeah,
that.
but they advertise it and they're selling out. Place is selling out.
Absolutely.
What if the question was more like this? Now, I'm trying to get biblical and I'm being metaphorical, okay? Please understand, this is a metaphor. But what if you're being called to give birth to something new? Now, it's kind of laughable to think of 67-year-olds giving birth, but guess what? It's biblical. Is it not? Metaphorically,
Sure.
right? Isaac was a miracle, right?
Sure.
John the Baptist, that was a miracle. So that even in Scripture, there are these moments of people who are beyond their prime, not proficient, but God is calling them to give birth to something new. And you and I all know people who did this, who've done this. And it doesn't have to be big and splashy, but something new. What is your postmenopausal baby? I don't know if that's really a good question. How about, what's your final gift to your loved ones and to the world? I know there are people with great means, financial means, actually are forced to do this sooner than the rest of us because they have to begin to think. They literally have resources to give as a gift, and they have to decide, how much would go to family, what can I do for the world? And we see these billionaires who are kind of supporting each other, and I mean it's kind of cool, I guess, and saying I'm going to give it away. And we're going to find a way to cure something. We're going to, whether it's the Gates or the, what's that other guy? The one who lives in a house that's 60 years old?
Warren Buffett.
Warren Buffett.
Warren Buffett, yeah.
Yes.
So their financial resources, and maybe yours also, sometimes forces this question, and that's good, but beyond the financial resources, what is your final gift? Now, don't get hooked up on all this final stuff, okay? You'll notice I'm saying this quite glibly, giving away your death, what's your final gift? But if you can't talk naturally about it, you'll never be able to do it, right? And starting in your 60s and 70s is the place to do this, not at 94, right? Because there may not be a lot left to create that final gift at that point. So at some point, these are the questions that come up. Y'all heard about the midlife crisis, right? I don't know, I'm sure it has a spiritual issue, there's probably a spiritual issue, but one way you could look at midlife crisis is these questions start to emerge and people just don't want to deal with them. So you get a new spouse, you get a new car, you buy a new job, whatever. What if we just dealt with the issue and went deep and did some spiritual work instead, is all I'm asking. Oh, did I miss something? Oh yeah, the restlessness in Europe. We don't need to talk about that. Okay, so I'm going to share a couple of authors and how they talk about this real quickly with you. The books, I'm going to probably ask Barb. Barb's been asking for my book list, and I finally now think, Barb, I have it together because I prepared the lesson. So I'm going to give these book lists to the library. These books will hopefully be available pretty soon. But I want to look at what people wiser than I and older than I have said about this third half of life. And the first one I want to talk about is Henry Nouwen. His book is Our Greatest Gift, A Meditation on Dying and Caring. Probably not his bestseller, absolutely not his bestseller. But he wrote this toward the end of his life, and he had some really interesting things to say. And I've shared some of this with you before. At a certain point in our lives, the question is no longer, what can I still do so that my life makes a contribution? I'm at that point. I don't know that my life, you know, that I'm gonna preach the sermon that's gonna save all the souls, or I'm not gonna build a new church, right? I'm not going to like train classrooms of seminarians to go out and change the world. I'll be honest, if y'all don't mind me showing how egotistical I was, I thought all those things were gonna be me when I was in 30, right? But thanks be to God, my ego is kind of tamed, and none of that. I mean, I don't ask the question, how can my life make a contribution? What big contribution am I gonna leave to the world? That's just not where I am anymore. Rather, how can I live now? And I may have 20, 30 years, right? How can I live these years so that my death will be a blessing to my family, to the church, and to the world? And I happen to just have one retired pastor in the room. I'm trying not to look at her over here, but I think that for religious leaders, we want our ending to also bless the church. I mean, it isn't just about us, it's about blessing the church, maybe the church we are serving at the moment, but also the larger church. So I know you resonate with that as I do, that it's not just about me, my family, but also the church and the world. And many of you are so dedicated to the church, you would want the same. The central question is not how much time do I have, but how can I prepare now so even in my dying, I can leave warm, nurturing, blessing spirit behind. No one ever sat me down until just a couple of months ago and said, you know, the way you live now will affect what's gone after you die, but not the way you always thought, right? You always thought it was what you built, or the money you gave, or the legacy. But I've done funerals of people who left nothing behind, whose legacies were so strong, right? And so that's what we're talking about, and that's spiritual work, right? That's spiritual work. It's about your spirit. And then he goes on to talk, this is my favorite line, if we die with guilt, shame, anger, or bitterness, that's the way we're gonna leave that to the world. And it can burden the lives of our family, our friends, our churches, our communities. Now y'all, I think the first time I heard this, I thought, I'm not that important. It's not gonna matter. What does it matter if I have a little bitterness in my heart at the end? You know, what if I don't let go of that one thing that I just want to take to my grave because that person wronged me so badly? Come on, it's not gonna matter. No one's gonna care. It's not gonna, the world's not gonna fall apart. But in a spiritual sense, we have time on this earth to do the inner work, to have none of that left at the end. None of it. What that leaves behind is very different than what's left behind when you're bitter or unforgiven or unforgiving. It's just different. If we die at peace, reconciled with our loved ones, with the world, in my case with the church, it is important to be reconciled with the church when it's been your punching bag and you've been theirs for a whole lifetime. With warm and grateful heart, then the warmth of love will be the spirit we leave behind. This may sound woo-woo. It's not. I've seen it. I've seen it in the last moments. I've seen people do this, like, right before they take their last breath. In fact, I'm wondering if you can't really die until you've done it. Now, I'm not a death and dying expert. I just sit with a lot of dying people. And that's just something that I wonder about. When I'm with someone who is actively dying and cannot die, and y'all know what I'm saying? They just can't. The family's like, it's been 9 days. She hasn't eaten, she hasn't slept, she hasn't, no water, what's going on? That's when we start to think about, as a family, unfinished business. Because I won't talk about giving our death away, because I think y'all are not quite ready for that. We'll move on.
Go back.
Go back?
So I'm thinking our homework assignment is in that last line. Stop focusing on our agenda and begin to focus on our obituary. Is that what you want?
Well, I've got an assignment like that, but it's a little better than that. We're going to talk about a living spiritual will, a living will that you can do now for the
Singing obituary.
So this is not a religious leader. This man was is a psychologist. He wrote a book called The Force of Character and the Lasting Life, which was pretty groundbreaking in its time. But he did ask a lot of important philosophical questions, like what did God have in mind when he designed the aging process? Wouldn't you love to just have a talk with God about that? What did you have in mind? Why did it happen like this? Why does it go like this? And the metaphor he came up with, he must have been a wine drinker, because he said, wine is better when it's mellowed, and the best wines, I don't know if this is true, but he wrote that the best wines are mellowed in old cracked barrels. Now, I think they do that in Europe. We don't do that here. But I've thought about what Jesus said is about old wine in new wineskins. It doesn't work. Old wine needs an old wineskin. And so with that metaphor, he started to ponder philosophically, what if aging and the process of aging was part of the grand scheme, the divine plan for us? And before you say, well, God seems kind of cruel, he said you've got to separate the aging process from dying. It's a huge mistake to read the signs of aging as indications of dying, rather than thinking about the signs of aging as initiations into another way of life. Okay, just think about that. The signs of aging as initiations into another way of life. I was talking about this with an older friend of mine saying, yeah, a way of life I don't want. That's human. That's human. But we prepare people to go to college. We prepare people to become new parents. When we're about to make someone an executive in a company who's never been an executive before, we have executive training programs, maybe, sort of, right?
Not really.
What if the aging process is simply an indication that it's time for another way of life, and it's time to get ready for that new way of life? And this is how he says it. Each physical diminishment from why we have to get up at night and go to the bathroom, why our skin sags, why we go dry, is designated to mature the soul. And they do their work without our consent, relentlessly and ruthlessly, which is true. It turns us all into monks, and I would say nuns, and that is indeed the plan. You said, I never signed up to be a monk or a nun. But just as John the Cross in the 1600s was saying, is it the 1600s? Am I right, Phil? Is it later? It's probably later.
No, that's about right.
About right? It's somewhere in those 200 years. Phil says that we're in those 200 years. Just as he was looking at the aging of monks way back then, this philosopher is saying the human being is aging and it initiates something new that you can either fight or you can welcome. And he, as a philosopher, not a religious person, said he thought it was part of God's design. The aging process turns us into monks, and that's the plan. Just as our bodies once pumped us with excessive hormones to drive us out of our homes into puberty, again, God is in this conspiracy. Aging isn't always pleasant or easy, but there's a rhyme and a reason to the process. I think about that when I get the blessing of spending every Friday from morning to night with my 3-year-old granddaughter. It seemed like a really good idea to be their caregiver because they don't have childcare on Fridays. And it seemed like a great idea at the time. And I've been doing it for 3 years, so I've gone through every stage with her while trying to work full time. And if y'all are here on a Friday and see me in the office, you'll see my little shadow with me because she's mine. But what Fridays remind me of is that there is a rhyme and reason to the aging process. I am very different than I was in my 20s and 30s. And y'all know this as grandparents, and we've got a lot of grandparents in here, that I bring something different to the table. I don't mean to. I mean, it's not like I sat down and planned it. I just don't have the energy, but I also don't have the anxiety, right? And I don't have the woulda, shoulda, coulda, maybe, what ifs. I have none of that with her. I get annoyed just like her mother and father did with her, but I am different. And I think there is a rhyme and a reason to that process. I think we are meant to relate to other generations in a different way, in a way that will serve them. But we don't always think about that. Aging deliteralizes biology. The soul finally gets to trump the body, and rise to the front. We can imagine aging as a transformation in beauty as much as in biology. The old are like images on display that transpose biological life into imagination in art. That's what we are, imagination in art. The old become strikingly memorable, ancestral representations, characters in the play of civilization, each a unique, irreplaceable figure of value. I think he goes a little off there. But I think it is true, the soul does trump the body in the end. And the body was built to age. And what happens when the body ages, the soul has more space, has more room, has more time. And that is not a bad thing, you know? It is not a bad thing. This is David Brooks, who, again, not a religious writer, but he wrote his book, The Second Mountain, using Judeo-Christian ideas. And he talks about the difference between the first mountain and the second mountain. The first mountain is that first half of life that you're just, climbing the mountain. But that the second mountain, midlife, is on contrast a focus on meaning, on moral joy, on interdependence. Notice one of the things you said you were afraid of was being dependent. Well, you're not meant to be dependent. The journey where we are is into interdependence. That's a very different thing than the journey to being like taken care of by someone. And the nice thing about being independent still is you can begin the process of the journey towards interdependence with family, who might eventually have to be your caregivers. But the interdependence starts now. It's a different kind of life. On relationships, listening, not talking. Because who has time to listen, right? On re-enchanting our perception of things. I love that line. Re-enchanting our perception of things. My perception of 3-year-olds has been re-enchanted. Not much better than saying, I'm dying of fatigue over this. No, it's being re-enchanted. Acts of love that take us beyond self-interest, loving others, making commitments and keeping them, giving oneself away as we age and move into the second half of life. There are 3 metaphors to growth. And this is his way of talking about you move from suffering to wisdom to service, from dying to the old self to cleansing in emptiness, to resurrection in the new, and from the agony of the valley of purgation into the desert to the insight on the mountaintop. These are just, you have to read the whole book to get this, but these are those steps as he sees it. 3 different metaphorical ways of looking at it, but here's my favorite. All this, he says, will leave us radiating a bright sadness, which is the depth of what the soul looks like on the surface. So all of these writers, they're coming from different perspectives, but what's so interesting is it has to do with inner work. When your body isn't able to do everything it used to do, and when you have time, when you have freedom, when you have the ability to be able to sit, to be able to listen, to be able to, then you can do new kinds of work. And I think retirement is a bit of a crock if you think it's about not working anymore. All right? Right? Because I like to say I don't want to work full-time anymore, but I don't really talk about retiring because I think there's going to be plenty of work. It's just, it'll look very differently. Okay, one last.
Stacy,
Yeah,
before you go
yes.
there, you
Yeah.
know, when he was, and some of his comments there about taking care of yourself, keeping your options open, finding yourself,
Yeah.
and then joy and stuff. That's kind of getting at what he brought up, roar. That's kind of what he gets at.
Exactly.
In the second half of life is you go back to, you kind of revisit your old joys and old loves that maybe had been set aside, you know, like whatever that is,
Right.
you know, taking care of children or,
Right.
or you know, art or whatever kind of passion you had earlier that you just kind of let go, and it's time to go back. A lot of times you go back and revisit those. So
You
that-
revisit things.
We have joy and stuff like that.
Well, and if you're doing inner work, you end up revisiting your narrative.
Yeah.
Your narrative about your early life, your
Right.
narrative about, I'm just thinking in general, I'm not thinking of any of you, but your narrative about your first marriage, your narrative about you as a young parent, your narrative about your career. It is so interesting as a younger pastor listening. I've spent my life with a lot of newly retired people, because who are the big workers in a church, especially in the Midwest where I had many pastorates? It was always those newly retired people. We would grab them. You know, you're now our treasurer.
Right.
You're now our this. You know, you're and so I was this younger woman building my career, spending time with newly retired, often men, but sometimes women as well, because this was the 80s and 90s, so whatever. And I learned really quickly that the way someone talked about their career right after they retired, very different than the way someone would talk about their career 10 years later, right? I mean, and not bad or good, just like, is that the same career? You know, but with inner work, with hindsight, the narrative starts to change. And it became less and less about what they accomplished and what they did and how many people they supervised. Newly retired people can tell you exactly how many people they supervised, how big their budget was, right? All these things, because they lived it. They're living it every day. 10 years later, you know, being in the defense industry in the 90s now, that was interesting. It really raised a lot of moral issues for me. And I'm like, 10 years ago you weren't talking about those moral issues. So I learned early on, that's a beautiful, because I got to be with these people for a decade, usually. What a beautiful thing was happening as they would work on their narrative a little bit. Okay, one last person, Kathleen Dowling Singh, who is not alive anymore, but she wrote a trilogy of books called The Grace of Aging, The Grace of Living, The Grace of Dying. She did it backwards, though. She first wrote The Grace of Dying, then The Grace of Aging, then The Grace of Living, right before she died, which is kind of interesting. And this is my favorite quote of hers, which I've shared with you before. The process of aging and dying is exquisitely calibrated to bring us into the realm of the spirit. Okay, let's unpack that. What does that mean to you? Exquisitely calibrated to bring us into the realm of the spirit. What do you think? That's just too heavy?
Exquisitely calibrated has to be God.
It has to be God.
Has to be God.
Has to be God.
As the
Yeah.
guide.
As the guide. The one who says, you know, now we have a little more time together. So let's spend these last 20 years doing things a little different, you know. There's wisdom in this process. Here's what it's designed to do. To break down your ego. Y'all heard me say that just the other day, right? Or just a few months ago. To break down your ego. Ego's a good thing. It makes us like produce, it creates, you know, you have to have an ego to create a good masterpiece. You have to have a good ego to manage people. You have to have a good ego to build things. Because you have to trust that you're smart enough and good enough, right? That you can accomplish these things. But there comes a time when, and this is what you were saying, Phil, when the ego is going to get in our way of doing deeper work. It's not necessary. I don't need, you know, it's so freeing to not need to be I don't even talk about what I don't need to be, but think about what you don't need to be anymore. Teacher of the year. I bet you didn't even think about this year, being teacher of the year, did you? It's like, guess what? I don't think about that anymore. Breaking down the ego. The process of aging and dying will do for us what a deep life of prayer and selflessness was meant to do for us. What does that mean? It'll break our selfishness and open us to the realm of the Spirit. So a deep life of prayer and selflessness turns one to the Spirit. Aging and dying does the same thing. I've been at the bedside of people who've been told that their time is limited, and so they know they're going to die. And the fascinating thing in that moment is, without like betraying anyone or anything, how many times the person, these are beautiful people, these are godly people, these are people that, you know, they've lived wonderful lives, but in that moment, they're like, could you show me something in Scripture right now about life after death? Because I really want to ponder that, you know. And that's fine. It's not, you know, it's not that they ever did anything wrong, but all of a sudden now, it's like, I want to hear what Apostle Paul has to say. You know, tell me what the Gospel of Luke has to say. Tell me what the Gospel of John has to say. So it's basically, the process is basically doing what like 10 years of Bible study might have done. But now there's urgency, and now there's passion, and there's meaning. And this isn't just selfish. When I've done this for people, it wasn't just for them, they wanted it for their family too. They're like, we, as a family, we need something, you know. You're the pastor, give us something, you know. God will give you something, it'll be good, it'll be good. It's worth thinking about, especially when people are really forced with a bad diagnosis, or, you know, given bad news. If they're people of spirit, it will bring up the questions that they need to answer, that the Spirit is urging them to answer. I'm not saying this is that you like it, I'm just saying this is what happens. And then the process of aging and dying has a clear intent. God will get us one way or the other. Now she meant that in a very, as a non-evangelical Christian, and kind of, I mean, she meant that in a kind of holistic way, that all souls are going back to God. That's what she meant. I look at this and think, you know, until the last breath, everyone, you know, God has opportunity with every single person. And that person does belong to God. So God's going to work on that person. And I leave that in God's hands. I don't worry so much about it. We have run out of time, but these are the things that we would be talking about, if we could. And that we'll talk about further. I want you to, this is your homework, okay? What are some of the ways, if we go back to that original metaphor, which is actually the easiest to digest, mellowing of the soul, you know? Who doesn't want to mellow out a little bit in this last third of life, right? In terms of, wouldn't you like some of the sharp edges just to be rubbed away? Wouldn't you like for things just to be a little bit easier? So let's stick with that metaphor a little bit. Do you see this happening to you or around you? Where do you see it happening? This mellowing of the soul. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about a conversation I had with this young colleague. I was with a young colleague. They're very young. And they made a comment about older people not being very accepting of new things. And there was a lot of people around, and I was like, I'm not gonna raise my hand. Though I look around the room and I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty much the oldest one.
There's good reason for that.
Huh?
There's good reason for
Well,
that.
yeah, that's right. So I looked around the room and thought, I'm the oldest person here, I'm gonna keep my mouth shut, I'm not gonna say anything. But later, I went up to this colleague and I said, I challenge you a little bit on that. I know that that is a stereotype. And older people sometimes do hold traditions and hold history, you know. But I challenge you to find a 70 or 80-year-old who hasn't mellowed their thinking about important issues or things that they held very tightly when they were younger. To this person's credit, they went away, they thought about it, and had a discussion with some older people, and came back to me and said, that was a really ageist comment, wasn't it? And I'm like, yes, it was. Thank you. There is nothing sadder in my mind than being with a 90-year-old person whose soul didn't get a chance to mellow, who is still incredibly bitter, who is still incredibly, who is holding on to things so tightly. Yeah.
I wish I could think who I read it from, that said if you haven't changed your mind about something in the last decade, then you haven't been thinking.
And that sounds like good advice for 60, 70, 80-year-olds. The world is changing tremendously. And we can hold some things that younger generations can't hold. Memories, good traditions. We have something, I mean, it's why they keep me around here, y'all, because I'm like, Stacy, how did we used to do that back in the olden days? We had a funeral with a casket here not long ago. I was the only pastor who had ever done funerals with caskets of the 4 pastors. I'm like, well, hey, there's some job security. I know some stuff. But so I think that we can get that reputation of being stodgy and being stuck in our ways. But when you can be in real dialogue with different generations, you can start to separate those things that we actually know and have some wisdom about versus not being able to change our minds. I'm not going to change my mind if it's wrong, but I certainly can change my mind about other things. If my 30-year-old self knew all the things I've changed my mind about, she would be shocked. She would be shocked. She'd be like, what? You know, but that's good. That's mellowing. That's a mellowing of the soul. And it's one thing to talk about things we change our mind about. It's another thing to talk about forgiveness, right? To talk about mercy. To talk about our vocation. What are we going to do next? So this is your homework. Where do you see this happening in you and around you? And what are some of the signs that it's not happening? I mean, you probably know someone whose soul needs some mellowing. What are some of the signs that it's not happening? Okay? So is this what you came for?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm making this up as I go along. Next week I'm going to talk specifically about forgiveness, because I think it's the one thing we all have in common that is a really important part of mellowing the soul, and it is great big spiritual work of this third half of life. So that's where we're going to go next week. Does that sound good? Well, thank you guys for your attention. I can go to work.